Chuck Norris just wanted a quiet evening out with his father at their old hometown bar, but a gang of bikers decided to humiliate them and laid hands on an elderly man. They thought they were attacking ordinary people. Within a minute, they would be begging for this to be just a movie. The highway stretched endlessly beneath the steady hum of the engine, a gray ribbon cutting through the sun-bleached desert. Heat shimmered in the distance, where the world dissolved into a haze that made mountains look like ghosts of themselves. Chuck Norris kept one hand steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the familiar yet distant road ahead. The sky was an unbroken expanse of blue, the kind he remembered from his youth, vast enough to make a man feel small, humble, and grounded. It had been too long since he last drove this way, too long since he had taken the time to return, not as the martial arts champion, not as the actor people recognize from posters and movies, but simply as a son coming home. Fame had a way of stealing time, years slipping by while the world watched him perform extraordinary feats on screen, believing that was who he truly was. But this journey wasn't for the cameras, nor for the crowds who cheered for him. This journey was for one man, his father. Chuck shifted slightly in his seat, letting the cool air from the vent wash across his face. The air smelled of dust and sunlight, strangely nostalgic, like childhood summers spent running barefoot down country roads, or waiting on the porch swing for his father's fire truck to return from another call. He could still see it so clearly, the sound of the siren fading, then the heavy truck stopping in front of their home. His father stepping out covered in soot, tired but alive, and always smiling when he saw his boys waiting. Those memories came back more vivid with every passing mile. His father had been his first hero long before the world decided to make Chuck one. The man was strength without arrogance, courage without applause. He didn't need the spotlight. The burning buildings and the terrified families he saved were enough. Now that same man walked slower, breathed heavier. Age had crept up on him while Chuck was filming and traveling, always promising himself that he would make more time soon. And yet soon kept moving farther away. That was the guilt sitting in the passenger seat beside him, silent, unavoidable. The scenery shifted gradually from desert to sparse signs of civilization. A worn-down gas station, a ranch fence that needed repairing, a billboard advertising a diner that once served the best cherry pie in the county. He smiled when he recognized it, though the paint was peeling now, and the cherry pie slice looked more depressed than appetizing. The town wasn't far. As he took the turn off the main highway, the speed of the world seemed to slow. Houses stood farther apart, each surrounded by wide patches of land that looked like they held generations of stories, some long forgotten. He passed the old school where he had once been just another quiet kid trying to figure out who he was. The playground was empty now, the swings still, but he could almost hear the laughter from decades ago. His heart thudded heavier as he approached the neighborhood where he grew up. Here everything felt smaller than he remembered. The trees weren't so towering, the streets not as long, and the sky didn't seem quite so infinite. Age had trimmed the edges of the world. But when he turned the final corner and his father's house came into view, Chuck felt something inside his chest loosen, like tension he didn't know he was holding, finally had permission to fall away. The house stood exactly as he'd left it, a single-story building with white paint that had faded but not surrendered. A porch swing creaked gently in the breeze, still hanging from the same hooks his father had reinforced when Chuck had once swung too hard and nearly pulled the entire beam down. The lawn was simple, neat, and alive with the soft rustle of summer grass. Chuck killed the engine and sat there for a moment, letting the silence settle. His father's pickup was in the driveway, old but cared for. Through the front window he saw movement, a shadow crossing the living room. His chest tightened with anticipation, nervous in a way he hadn't been in years. It felt like going on stage, but this time the performance was real. He finally stepped out of the car. Gravel crunched under his boots, just as he remembered. The air tasted cleaner than anything in Los Angeles. He took one step toward the porch, and then the front door opened. His father stood there, leaning slightly on the door frame, not because he was weak, but because old habits lingered from years of work where taking even a second to rest your weight could save you later. He looked smaller than Chuck remembered, but age had sharpened the presence in his eyes rather than dulled it. There was a spark stubborn, alive. For a moment neither spoke. Their eyes carried the conversation acknowledgement of years lost, gratitude for years still ahead, and love that didn't need to be said aloud. Then his father broke the stillness with a familiar, gruff smile that pulled a matching one from Chuck instantly. They stepped toward each other, and Chuck wrapped him carefully in an embrace, mindful of the slight stiffness in the older man's back. But his father hugged him with the strength of someone who refused to let life beat him down entirely. When they separated, his father slapped him lightly on the arm. "Good to see you, son," he said. "No drama, no grand emotion, just sincerity." Chuck had always admired that. Inside, the house smelled like coffee and old books. Picture frames lined the walls, family photos, fire department groups, newspaper clippings celebrating brave rescues. Many featured his father as a younger man, broad-shouldered, confident, fearless. Chuck paused at one where his father stood holding a small boy with messy hair and wide, adoring eyes. Chuck remembered that day. His father had lifted him up to show him a medal he'd just earned. Chuck had thought it was the most beautiful thing in the world. Now the medals hung neatly in a case near the mantel, shining reminders of a life lived with purpose. They talked for a long while, filling the room with stories that softened the edges of silence. His father asked about Hollywood, but he wasn't interested in celebrity gossip. He wanted to know if Chuck was doing well, if he was happy, if he was taking care of himself. Chuck didn't brag. He shared. And his father listened the way only he ever did fully. As the sun lowered and the shadows across the living room stretched longer, his father stood up a little slower than before and suggested they head out for dinner. There was a small bar downtown, a place they used to go after Little League games or after his father finished a tough shift. "It's changed a bit," his father admitted, "but I still like to go now and then. Reminds me that I'm not dead yet." Chuck laughed gently, trying to hide the flicker of worry at the mention of changes. But the idea of returning to a place filled with memories felt right. It felt like another step back into something real. They grabbed their jackets and stepped outside. Evening light washed the house in gold, and for a brief moment Chuck paused, taking in every detail as if photographing it in his mind. He didn't want to forget again. His father locked the door, and they walked toward the truck together. Chuck moved slightly closer, just in case his father's slower pace faltered. But the older man walked upright and with pride, refusing to lean on anything but his own resolve. They drove into town with windows open, letting the warm breeze carry hints of barbecue and cut grass. The town's main street glowed under flickering neon signs. People walked along sidewalks, some laughing, some lost in thought. Life went on, quietly, imperfectly. When they parked outside the bar, Chuck noticed motorcycles lined up near the entrance. Sleek chrome, loud pipes machines that announced themselves without apology. The laughter spilling out from inside was rowdy, a bit too loud. Something changed here indeed. He glanced at his father, who simply gave a small shrug as if to say, "It is what it is," and maybe it was enough. Chuck took a deep breath, telling himself they were just here to have a good meal and a quiet night. That was all. He didn't come to fight or to prove anything to anyone. But he didn't yet know that inside those walls, lit by neon beer signs and noisy bravado, the quiet night he hoped for would not be what the world had planned. With that unspoken tension hanging in the air, they walked through the door together, unaware that before long the world would once again demand to see whether Chuck Norris was a legend only on screen or in the moments that truly mattered. It started with a simple step into the bar, like stepping across a threshold where the past waited to greet the future. And as the door swung shut behind them, the night quietly prepared its test. The first thing that hit Chuck when he and his father stepped inside was the sound. It rolled over them like a wave too loud, too sharp, a rough mix of laughter, clinking glass, and the heavy thump of rock music from a jukebox in the corner. This wasn't the low murmur of neighbors unwinding after a long day, or the lazy clatter of cutlery from families sharing a meal. It was harsher, wilder, threaded with a kind of careless energy that had nothing to do with the place he remembered. The air was thicker, too. Years ago, the bar had smelled of grilled steaks, fried potatoes, coffee, and the faintest hint of spilled beer. Now it carried a more bitter cocktail. Cigarette smoke clinging stubbornly to curtains and closed despite indoor bans, cheap cologne, motor oil, and the sharp tang of something stronger than beer behind the counter. For a moment, Chuck simply stood there, letting his eyes adjust, while his memories tried to superimpose the past over what he saw now. It was like looking at a familiar face that had been bruised and toughened by time. His father took a slow breath beside him, eyes sweeping the room in a way that told Chuck this wasn't his first time seeing the place like this. The older man's jaw tightened imperceptibly, but he didn't turn around or hesitate. He just stepped forward, as if walking through the remnants of something he had already mourned quietly and accepted. The layout of the bar hadn't changed much. The long wooden counter still ran along the left side, its surface scarred by decades of elbows, spilled drinks, and restless fingers. Booths lined the opposite wall, red vinyl cracked in spots, some patched with duct tape that gleamed under the neon beer signs. A few high tables stood scattered in the middle, surrounded by mismatched stools. The old television above the bar had been replaced with a flat screen, where a muted sports channel played highlights no one seemed to be watching. The biggest difference sat in the back right corner. A cluster of motorcycles, jackets, leather, denim, and boots occupied 3 tables that had once been the quiet sanctuary for off-duty firefighters and factory workers. Now black vests with patches sprawled over chairbacks. Metal chains clinked as men shifted in their seats, and helmets lay piled on an empty stool like the shells of some mechanical creatures. The men who wore the vests held themselves with the easy arrogance of those who were used to taking up space without being challenged. They laughed loudly, slapped each other on the back, and spoke with that particular kind of casual cruelty that came when you never worried anyone would push back. Chuck's eyes passed over them in a quick, instinctive assessment. He picked out the leader almost immediately, a broad-shouldered man with a shaved head, save for a short, bristling strip of hair down the center, a thick beard, and eyes that never quite softened, even when he smiled. The others seemed to orbit him, glancing toward him to see whether he found something amusing or worthy of notice. There were 7, maybe 8 of them clustered together, all variations on a theme. Leather vests with the same emblem, weathered faces or young ones trying hard to look older. Tattoos crawling along forearms and creeping up necks. His father didn't look at them long. He angled toward an empty booth nearer the middle of the room, not close enough to the bar to be in the thick of things, not far enough back to be cornered. It was, Chuck realized, the choice of a man who had spent a lifetime reading spaces and exits without thinking about it. "Over here," his father said quietly, nodding toward the booth. Chuck followed, sliding into the seat opposite. The vinyl complained softly under his weight. For a brief moment as they settled, he glimpsed what this place had once been. His father in the same booth, wearing his uniform shirt and an exhausted smile, setting down a mug of coffee, the two of them talking about Little League and homework and the importance of finishing what you started. The ghosts of that time flickered at the edges of his mind, then were pushed aside by the clatter of a glass falling somewhere near the bar and a burst of laughter from the biker's corner. A waitress appeared at their table, not much younger than Chuck, though life had drawn fine lines around her eyes. Her hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and her smile carried both friendliness and caution, like someone practiced in staying neutral around potential trouble. She greeted his father by name, and her expression genuinely warmed for a moment as she asked how he'd been. He responded with that calm, steady tone that made even a casual hello sound sincere. She turned to Chuck next, her eyebrows lifting slightly in recognition, but to her credit she didn't gasp or point or make a spectacle. Something flickered in her eyes, a mix of surprise and amusement, but she smoothed it over with professionalism. They ordered simple things: a burger and coffee for his father, grilled chicken, and iced tea for Chuck. She jotted down their choices and moved off, weaving around tables with the ease of long practice. For a few minutes, Chuck allowed himself to relax. He watched his father lean back in the booth, shoulders dropping slightly as the familiar surroundings helped him settle in. They spoke about the town, the store on the corner that had closed, the new development beyond the old mill, the neighbor who had moved away suddenly without saying much. It was ordinary conversation, and it felt good. The roar from the biker's corner hovered like background static, present but not yet intrusive. It didn't stay that way for long. From somewhere behind him came a sudden bark of laughter, followed by words spoken loud enough to slice cleanly through the hum of the bar. Chuck didn't catch the full sentence at first, only the tone, mocking, exaggerated, the way someone spoke when they wanted everyone to hear them. A second later, another voice chimed in, and this time the words were clear. "Hey, you seeing this? That guy over there looks just like him. You know, the karate cowboy from those old movies." Chuck felt his father's eyes shift past his shoulder for a brief moment. The older man's gaze flicked toward the sound, then back to his son, with a look that said he had heard too many variations of this kind of thing to be surprised. "They must be bored tonight," his father murmured, keeping his voice low. Chuck offered a small, almost amused smile. "Let's hope they find something else to focus on." He turned his attention back to their table, but he could feel the weight of several pairs of eyes settling on him like heat lamps. He had experienced this kind of thing before. Airports, restaurants, grocery stores. Some people approached with respect, some with awkward excitement, some with crude jokes. Most meant no harm. He had long ago learned to distinguish between curiosity and hostility, and what he heard behind him now carried a different edge. "Come on, man, that's totally him," another voice insisted, louder this time. "Look at the beard. You telling me that's not Chuck Norris?" A ripple of laughter followed, and someone clanged a bottle against a table as if punctuating the question. The jukebox music shifted tracks in the background, but the biker's conversation cut right through it. "Yeah, sure," someone else said. "And I'm Bruce Lee." The leader's voice joined the chorus then, deep and amused. "Doesn't matter who he is. If he's here, he came to drink, not perform. Let the man eat." For a moment, Chuck thought that might be the end of it. There was a flicker of grudging sense in those words. But almost immediately, another voice, higher, sharper, piped up with a different energy. "Oh, come on, boss. You mean to tell me you wouldn't pay to see him try that spinning kick in real life? I bet he can't even lift his leg that high anymore." More laughter. Chuck stared at the condensation on his glass, tracing one finger absently through the moisture. He knew exactly what they were doing. They were amusement hunting, poking at something to see if it would bark, just to give them a story to tell later about how they'd messed with someone famous. His father watched him across the table, quiet, reading him the way only a parent could. There was concern there, but also trust. He knew his son could handle himself, but he also knew what it meant to be provoked in public. "Food will be here soon," his father said casually, picking up his napkin and unfolding it on his lap as if nothing out of the ordinary were happening. "I hope they haven't changed the fries." Chuck smiled, appreciating the distraction. "If they did, that's one more thing this town will have to answer for." They both chuckled softly, the shared humor forming a small island of normalcy between them. He let the laughter from the bikers wash over his back, choosing not to turn around. Ignoring them was often the simplest way to steal their fun. People hungry for a reaction usually lost interest when denied it, but the men behind him were not the kind to settle easily. "Hey!" a voice suddenly called out, sharp and direct this time. "Hey, Hollywood!" The word hit the air like a thrown bottle. Conversations at nearby tables faltered. Chuck's father's mouth tightened slightly. Chuck's hand stilled around his glass. "Just keep talking to me," his father said quietly. "Look at me, not them." It was advice he had once given Chuck when he was a boy being taunted on the playground. Focus on what matters, ignore the noise. It echoed now, but the stakes felt different. Chuck kept his eyes on his father's face, seeing not just the man sitting before him, but the younger version from his memories, sweat drenched from a fire, yet still stopping to check whether his sons had eaten dinner. "Guess he only turns around when someone yells, 'Action!'" a biker joked loudly. Laughter again, rougher now, tinged with something more than amusement. The waitress appeared briefly at their table with their drinks, her shoulders slightly hunched, as though trying to become smaller between the storm clouds gathering in the room. Her smile flickered uncertainly as she set the glasses down and moved away quickly. Chuck took a slow sip of his iced tea. It was cold, crisp, grounding. He felt the familiar stir of something awakened deep inside him. Not anger exactly, but a heightened awareness. He could sense the room in layers, The bikers behind him, the nervous glances from other customers, the bar staff pretending not to look while being unable not to. He had been in situations far more dangerous than this, but those had been choreographed, controlled, surrounded by cameras and crew. This was different. This was real, unpredictable. Still, he chose silence. There was a difference between refusing to be provoked and being afraid. He was not afraid. Another chair scraped across the floor. The footsteps that followed were heavy and unhurried, the kind of stride a man used when he wanted everyone to see he was not sneaking up on anyone. Chuck heard it approach, heard it stop somewhere just to the side of their booth. His father's eyes flicked upward, watching whoever had come to stand there. "So," the newcomer said, voice dripping with exaggerated friendliness, "you're too good to say hello to fans now, huh?" Chuck set his glass down with deliberate care before finally turning his head. The biker standing beside their table was in his 30s maybe, with long hair tied back and a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. His leather vest bore the same emblem as the others, the patch worn but proudly displayed. He reeked faintly of beer and something stronger, his posture that of a man used to leaning into trouble. "I'm just having dinner with my father," Chuck replied calmly. "That's all." The biker gave a half laugh, shaking his head as if amused. Yeah, family time." "Cute. We're just saying." He spread his hands as though trying to appeal to logic. "You're sitting here like some regular Joe, but we all know you're not. You're the guy who beats up 10 people at once in movies, right? Jumps through windows? Kicks people so hard they fly across the room?" Chuck said nothing. The images the man described were absurd, stylized, often played with a wink to the audience, but they had been repeated enough that some people forgot there was a difference between choreography and reality. "We're just curious," the biker pressed. "What happens when it's not staged? When it's not scripted? You gonna do that spinny kick thing if someone actually swings at you? Or is that all camera tricks?" The laughter from the corner rose again, fueled by the performance of their comrade. A part of Chuck wanted to sigh. His father's gaze was steady on him, as if asking silently, "What are you going to choose?" He chose the same thing he had chosen on sets, in interviews, on the street when someone shoved a phone in his face without asking. He chose control. "I'm not here to entertain you," Chuck said in an even voice. "I'm just here to eat. That's all." The biker's mouth twisted slightly, the smirk souring. "Oh, come on, don't be like that. You're an actor, man. Entertaining people is literally your job." There it was, the word thrown like a dart. Actor. To most people it was a simple description, neither insult nor praise. But in the mouths of some men, like this one, it carried contempt. It suggested that what Chuck did was fake, that his strength was a costume, his courage a special effect. Behind the biker, at the table in the corner, the leader watched now with open interest. He leaned back in his chair, one arm draped along the top of the seat, eyes narrowed slightly. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was measuring. Chuck turned back to face his father, letting the biker stand there ignored for a heartbeat too long to be accidental. His father understood what he was doing and played along, picking up the thread of their previous conversation as if nothing had happened. They spoke about a neighbor's dog, about the weather, about anything but the man looming over them. The biker's patience frayed. He shifted his weight, one hand dropping to the table, fingers tapping near Chuck's glass. The movement was small, but the intent behind it was louder than any shout. "You don't talk to me when I talk to you, Norris?" he asked, the friendliness gone now, replaced by something harder. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" Chuck could feel the room tightening, air growing heavier as attention stiffened like a shared-held breath. He knew if he looked around he would see a dozen faces pretending not to watch, ears straining for every word. This was how these stories started, how they spread, and in every retelling, the details would change depending on who told it. He kept his voice calm. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. I just came to have a quiet evening with my dad. That's all." The biker snorted. "Quiet evening," he says, like he owns the place. His eyes flicked briefly to Chuck's father, then back again. He tilted his head, appraising. "You know what I think? I think without cameras, you're just another old man sitting with an even older man. Take away the lights and the music and the stunt guys, and there's nothing left." That earned a laugh from the table in the corner, though not from every man seated there. Some shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Chuck's father, at the lines on his face and the way he held himself despite them. They might not have known who Chuck really was, but they recognized age when they saw it. There were boundaries, lines many men who'd seen real hardship preferred not to cross, but some lines meant nothing to men drunk on their own bravado. Chuck felt the insult more on his father's behalf than his own. He had been called worse than old man in his life. Fame painted targets on your back. That was part of the deal. But his father? His father had earned every mark time put on him. To have that dismissed with a sneer scraped something raw deep inside him. His father saw it. He reached slowly across the table and wrapped his fingers around his coffee cup, not to drink, but as if to ground himself. His eyes stayed on Chuck, giving him an anchor. Let it go, those eyes seemed to say. Not yet, not for this. And so Chuck did, for now. He swallowed the sharp words that rose in his throat and let silence speak for him. He did not flinch, did not look away, but he also did not rise. He chose very deliberately not to give the biker what he wanted. For a long moment, that refusal hung there between them like a suspended weight. Then the biker exhaled loudly, a mocking little huff. Fine, sit there and pretend we don't exist, he said, pushing off the table. But don't forget, you're in our bar now, cowboy, not on your movie set. He walked away, back toward the corner cluster of vests and boots. His friends greeted him with pats on the back and half-whispered comments. Some laughed. Some shook their heads. The leader listened to the quick recap, his eyes never leaving Chuck's table even as the others spoke into his ear. For a brief while, the noise of the bar rose again, conversation flowing around, the tension like water around a stone. The waitress returned with their food, setting down plates with hands that trembled only slightly. She offered a tentative smile, as if asking whether they were all right without being so bold as to voice it. We're fine, Chuck's father said gently. Thank you. They began to eat. The fries were, surprisingly, very much like they had always been. Crisp on the outside, soft inside, salted just enough. For several minutes they focused on that small, simple pleasure, eating not because they were starving, but because routine had a way of steadying the mind. Chuck chewed, swallowed, and listened. He heard the bikers' voices rise and fall, heard glasses clink, heard the muted voice of the sportscaster on the television calling a replayed touchdown. He felt the tension like a low hum beneath it all, a current running through the room that you didn't notice until you stepped into it. The encounter had not exploded into violence. Not yet. But something had shifted, and everyone knew it. The challenge had been issued and denied, but not withdrawn. The air was thick with expectations dangled and unmet. His father took a sip of coffee, then set the mug down carefully. His eyes met Chuck's again across the table. I know that look, the older man said quietly. You're doing the right thing. Chuck nodded once, though the compliment brought him little comfort. Doing the right thing didn't always mean the right thing would follow. He had seen enough of life to know that sometimes, no matter how patient you tried to be, trouble kept coming. Behind him, the biker's laughter grew a shade darker, the jokes morphing into something quieter, more threatening. They had poked the bear, and when the bear hadn't roared, they were deciding what to do next. For his part, Chuck finished another fry and forced his shoulders to stay relaxed. He had chosen to ignore them for now. Chosen peace, chosen restraint. It was a choice he would keep making as long as it protected the man sitting across from him. But choices, he knew, were only half the story. The other half was what the world chose in return. Chuck had been in tense rooms before. He knew the sounds they made, the way laughter turned brittle, how conversations around the edges thinned into silence even when mouths still moved. He could feel when an environment shifted from normal discomfort into something volatile. The bar was shifting now. It wasn't one moment, not one word. It was a slow tightening, like the world drawing in breath and waiting to see who would exhale first. The food helped for a time. Chuck focused on the meal, savoring small details he hadn't experienced in a while. The crunch of lettuce, the tang of a sauce that, somehow, tasted exactly as he remembered from decades earlier. His father ate quietly across from him, pausing sometimes to glance toward the bar counter, not because he expected help from there, but because he seemed to be measuring how isolated the two of them were. In the background, one of the bikers tried and failed to toss a peanut into the mouth of another. When the peanut bounced harmlessly off the man's cheek, they erupted into another round of laughter that felt more like dogs barking than people having fun. It was almost comical in its childishness, but immaturity did not make a situation harmless. Often it made things worse. A man who felt foolish looked for someone else to carry his embarrassment. Chuck finished a sip of his drink and could feel his father watching him. The older man seemed to want to speak, but held whatever he wanted to say behind sealed lips. He had always been a man who counted his words the way a careful gambler counted his chips. Nothing wasted, everything deliberate. "They'll lose interest," his father finally said in a low voice. "Bullies always do once they see they can't get to you." Chuck nodded as though he agreed. In truth, he wasn't so sure. Bullies in movies could be predictable. Real ones rarely were. Their waitress returned briefly to check on them, and the brief interruption cut through the tension like a tiny relief valve. She gave them a sympathetic little smile, as though silently apologizing for the rest of the room. When she turned away, Chuck caught sight of her hands trembling, just enough to suggest she, too, was hoping the night wouldn't escalate further. For a few moments, the bar returned to its regular, chaotic hum. Chuck and his father continued eating, but the uneasy peace couldn't last. It never does when cracks have already begun to show. Behind Chuck, a chair scraped harshly against the floor. The sound was deliberate, meant to draw attention. Chuck didn't turn immediately. Instead, he set his fork down, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and waited for the next move. It came in the form of approaching footsteps, heavier this time, slower, carrying weight like someone convinced the entire room ought to feel his presence. Chuck didn't move until the man was right beside their table again, shadow falling over his meal like a storm cloud, blotting out the sun. "Well, would you look at that?" the biker said loudly, addressing his friends more than Chuck. "He thinks he's too good to look at us, too good to even acknowledge we exist." Chuck turned his head only slightly, giving the man the calmest expression he could manage. "I'm just trying to enjoy a meal." The biker leaned closer, planting a hand on the edge of the table. "You ignoring us is you trying to enjoy a meal. Us ignoring you would—" He paused, lips curling in a grin that held nothing human. "Actually, that wouldn't be any fun." Chuck's father straightened in his seat, his aged but unwavering gaze lifting to the biker's face. That quiet motion alone was enough to momentarily shift attention his way. The biker looked at him and smirked. "Look at this one. Grandpa here thinks I care what he's looking at." Chuck felt his heart clench. He kept his hands relaxed on the table, but his grip on self-control tightened. He saw out of the corner of his eye his father's fingers curl slightly on the tabletop. Not in fear, but in restraint. "We don't want any trouble," Chuck said evenly. "We just came here to eat. That's all." "Wrong," the biker replied instantly. "Everything is trouble when someone like you walks in. You think you're better than us. You think Hollywood makes you some kind of god." Chuck didn't respond to that. He didn't need to. The biker was searching for a spark, and Chuck refused to give it. But there was someone else he could reach. The biker's eyes flicked back to Chuck's, father sharp, predatory. "Hey, old man, you proud of your little movie star? Sitting there, acting like he's—" Before he could finish, Chuck's father spoke for the first time directly to the biker. "My son is nobody's little anything," he said, voice steady and slow. Age had roughened it, but that only made it stronger. "He's a good man. That's more than I can say for someone who picks on strangers while drunk and bored." Time seemed to freeze for 2 seconds. Chuck wished his father hadn't said it. Not because it wasn't true, it was, but because truth only added fuel when directed at the kind of man who didn't know what to do with it. The biker's smirk evaporated. He leaned down until his face was inches from the older man's. Chuck could smell the alcohol on his breath from where he sat. The biker's voice dropped into something darker. "Careful, old-timer. You might break a hip saying stupid things like that." Chuck's father didn't flinch, not even an inch. He held the biker's stare with the same quiet strength Chuck remembered from when he was a child, and thunderstorms would rattle the windows. And that was enough to tip the biker over the edge. He reached out and grabbed Chuck's father by the front of his shirt fingers, twisting into the fabric, jerking him forward with no care for the pain such a motion must have caused. The old man gasped softly and caught himself on the table, trying not to fall. That sound, barely more than a breath, was the last thing Chuck needed to hear. He stood up from the booth without a word, without hesitation. The motion was fluid, inevitable, as natural to him as breathing. The biker straightened too, body tensing in anticipation of a fight. But Chuck wasn't ready to fight. Not yet. He needed to get his father out of reach first. Chuck placed one hand gently on his father's shoulder, checking for injury. His father winced slightly but nodded. He was all right, at least for now. "Sit back," Chuck said quietly to him, not taking his eyes off the biker. "Let me handle this." His father obeyed, but reluctantly. It wasn't submissive obedience. It was trust. He had taught Chuck everything he knew about strength, and now he was stepping back to let that knowledge take shape. The biker, emboldened by the attention of everyone watching, puffed out his chest. "There he is." The cowboy stands up. Finally. Chuck said nothing. He didn't rise to the bait, didn't respond to the mockery. He simply stood his ground like a mountain that refused to move. The leader of the bikers called out from the corner, "Hey, relax, Travis. Let's not break the old man. We're here to have fun." The biker named Travis sneered. "I am having fun." Chuck saw the shift how. Travis wasn't just posturing anymore. He was itching for release, needing to hurt something, and the old man wasn't going to be the target. Travis released his father and shoved him back into the booth, harder than necessary. Chuck's father gritted his teeth and caught himself again, eyes flaring, not with fear but fury. "Hey," Chuck said quietly, but the single word carried steel. The biker turned fully toward him now. "Oh, he speaks," he mocked. Chuck's posture changed only slightly, a shift in weight, a leveling of the eyes, but it was enough to send a silent ripple through the room. The energy changed again. People knew what was coming. Even Travis, in his drunken arrogance, paused long enough to sense it. But pride was a stubborn poison, and Travis was drunk on pride. "What's the matter, tough guy?" he taunted. "Afraid your daddy's gonna get hurt?" Chuck didn't react. He had mastered his expression long ago. Fame had taught him that silence could be a weapon sharper than any retort. And that silence drove Travis mad. He threw his arms wide. "Come on then! Do something! Show us what all those movies are about!" The laughter from the biker table surged again. Chairs scraped, boots shifted against the floor. Now several of them were standing, watching like spectators around a ring. Some patrons near the bar quietly slipped away from their stools or turned their bodies sideways, as though angling for escape if things went wrong. Chuck's father's breath had become shallow. He looked angry, truly angry, because he understood now that these men had crossed a line no decent man allowed to be crossed. He opened his mouth, maybe to warn Chuck not to be reckless, maybe to say he was sorry for letting this happen. But Chuck placed a steadying hand on the tabletop between them. Just enough to say, "I've got this." A memory flickered through his mind without being summoned. Himself as a boy, watching his father step into a burning house, while flames licked upward like living monsters. He had asked him once, "Aren't you scared?" His father had answered simply, "Of course I'm scared. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do in spite of it." Chuck wasn't scared now. He was focused. Travis shoved him lightly with 2 fingers, testing, childish. "Come on, show me. Or are you just fake after all?" Chuck didn't blink. His body stayed loose, relaxed. But inside him, a boundary had been set in stone. "You can insult me," he said finally, voice low but carrying through the room. "You can say whatever you want about me, but you don't touch my father." It wasn't a threat. It was a truth, spoken like a verdict. The leader in the corner sat forward now, interest sharpened. He rested his elbows on his knees, studying the scene with calculating eyes. Others around him smirked or murmured encouragement. Travis cracked his knuckles theatrically. "Or what? You'll kick me through a window?" Chuck met his gaze unflinching. He didn't need to describe what he would do. His confidence didn't rely on words. Travis stepped closer, too close, and hissed, "You and your old man should have eaten somewhere else." Everything that came next happened with the inevitability of gravity. Travis moved first. His hand lashed out again toward Chuck's father, aiming for another shove, maybe the kind that would send him sprawling this time. That was the final mistake. Chuck's body reacted before thought registered. His hand snapped up, catching Travis's wrist in a grip that turned flesh and bone into a vice. The sudden stop surprised Travis more than pain did. Chuck's voice was quiet, but filled with a power that cut straight through the noise. "I warned you!" Somewhere behind them, a glass hit the counter. Someone whispered, "Oh no!" Chuck released the wrist only long enough to move between his father and the biker entirely, creating an unbreakable wall. The bar's energy drew taut like a wire pulled too tight. Travis stumbled back a step, startled that someone had actually stood up to him. Before the moment could resolve itself, another biker, larger, angrier, stormed forward, shoving his chair aside. The leader didn't stop him. In fact, his lips curved in satisfaction. They wanted this. They wanted to see whether Chuck Norris was a legend outside of his films. The second biker's voice cut across the room. "You think you can take us all on, old man?" Chuck didn't reply. He didn't have to. Travis lunged again. The line had been crossed. Now there was no turning back. Travis lunged with the wild, clumsy force of someone who believed aggression alone was enough to win a fight. Chuck shifted only slightly, just enough to let the biker's momentum betray him. Travis stumbled past, throwing out a hand to catch himself on the edge of a nearby table. A bottle tipped and shattered against the floor, sending the sharp sound slicing through the room like a warning bell. Every face in the bar turned toward them now, some wide-eyed, some hungry for spectacle, most frozen by the knowledge that whatever happened next would decide the tone of the evening, and maybe much more than that. Chuck positioned himself squarely between the bikers and his father, like a dam bracing against a rising flood. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't take a fighter's stance. Instead, his arms hung at his sides, relaxed, ready, steady. Travis recovered his footing and turned with a snarl, twisting his lips. But the expression faltered when his eyes met Chuck's. The calm in Chuck's gaze wasn't confidence. It was inevitability. The look of a man who knew exactly what he was capable of and exactly what he would not allow. Travis opened his mouth, but before a word could spill out, the bar's leader finally stood. He rose from his chair with the kind of controlled power that made the room instinctively quiet. He wasn't angry. If anything, he looked intrigued, even entertained, like a spectator settling into a better seat for a show he hadn't paid enough to enjoy. He took a slow step forward, then another, boots striking the floor with a solid, authoritative thud that echoed between the walls. Chuck watched him approach but didn't move. He only shifted his weight slightly as he glanced to his left to his father. The older man wasn't cowering. He wasn't shrinking away. Even after the rough shove that had clearly caused him pain, he sat upright, jaw clenched and eyes blazing with defiance. His breathing was uneven, but there was no fear in him. Pride, maybe. Anger, certainly. A lifetime of standing his ground against heat and smoke and collapsing walls had forged him into something unshakable. The leader stopped just a few feet from Chuck and crossed his arms over his chest. "You've got a set on you," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the kind of weight that comes from never needing to shout to be heard. Most people would be crawling for the door by now. Chuck said nothing. The leader tilted his head as if appraising a fine piece of machinery. "But you're not most people, are you? You're the man who beats up entire armies in movies. You're the guy who walks away from explosions without looking at them. You're the living legend." His grin sharpened. "So tell me, what happens when the script stops?" Chuck could have responded. He could have warned them. He could have tried to de-escalate again, even now. But he sensed the tipping point had already been reached. These men didn't want peace. They wanted proof. His father pushed himself to his feet with effort, wincing only slightly. His shoulders squared, and for a moment, the years fell away from him. He stood like the man who used to lead rookie firefighters into infernos and walk them out again alive. His voice, when it came, was rough but strong. "My son doesn't owe you anything," he said. "He doesn't need to prove a damn thing to anyone in this room." Travis scoffed loudly and turned toward him. "Oh yeah? And who the hell are you? Some washed-up old has-been riding your kid's fame?" Chuck's father stared him down. "I served this community for 38 years, he said. "While you were busy playing tough in bars, I was dragging people out of burning buildings at 2 in the morning. So don't talk to me about being washed up. You wouldn't last a minute doing half the things I've done." Several bikers shifted uneasily. Respect, even reluctant, flickered in a few eyes. Real men recognized real courage, even when it came from someone older, slower, but unbroken. But Travis wasn't one of those men. He stepped closer and jabbed a finger at Chuck's father's chest. "You think that matters now?" he spat. "You think any of that makes you someone worth listening to?" His voice rose, ugly and sharp. "Nobody cares what you used to be. You're nothing. And your son—" He didn't finish the sentence. Chuck's hand shot out. Not striking, not hitting, just closing around Travis's wrist with speed and precision that came from decades of discipline. Travis froze, surprised by how quickly the tables had turned. Chuck's voice, when it came, was low and cold, like a calm before a storm. "He is my father," Chuck said. "You will show him respect." The leader chuckled softly, not because he found it amusing, but because he appreciated the game escalating. "Looks like he's finally waking up," he said to the others. The second in command, a burly man with a shaved scalp and a scar running along his cheek, took a step forward. His fist curled. "Let's wake him up all the way." Chuck's father reached out, gripping Chuck's arm, not to pull him back, but to steady himself as he stood forward again. "Enough," he said loudly, surprising everyone, including Chuck. "My son doesn't need to fight you, and I won't let you drag him into your drunken nonsense." He paused, drawing a breath. "But I'll be damned if I let you insult him again." For a flicker of a moment, the room seemed suspended. Chuck looked at his father, not with fear, but with pride. Even outnumbered, outmatched physically, aged and worn, his father stood with a bravery that had defined his entire life. The burly biker laughed dismissively and placed a hand on the older man's shoulder. "Too hard. Sit down before you get hurt." Chuck's father didn't sit. "Take your hand off me," he said. It wasn't a threat. It was a command. The biker shoved him instead. Chuck caught his father before he could stumble too far, but that push, thoughtless, careless, ignited something deep inside him. He looked up slowly, eyes locking onto the man who had laid his hands on the person Chuck respected more than anyone on earth. The leader saw it immediately. "Uh-oh," he drawled. "Looks like Daddy's boy's angry." The sarcasm didn't matter. Words didn't matter anymore. Chuck's father put his hand on his son's forearm again, not trembling this time, but firm. He looked into his son's eyes and saw everything he had ever taught him reflected back. Restraint, courage, honor. A lifetime of lessons standing between violence and justice, as thin but unbreakable as a firefighter's hose line. "You do what you have to," his father said quietly, "but remember who you are." Chuck nodded once. He turned back toward the bikers. His shoulders lowered. His stance solidified. He breathed in deeply, the kind of breath one takes before stepping into a fire. The leader smirked and spread his arms. "So, what now? You gonna start?" He didn't finish, because his father moved first. The shove wasn't hard. It wasn't even particularly fast. But Chuck's father pushed the burly biker back a single step, just enough to reclaim dignity stolen from him. Just enough to remind them all that age had not beaten him. The room gasped. It was the biker's turn to be stunned, not by the force of the move, but by the audacity. An old man standing up for his son, standing up for himself. Then with a growl, the biker surged forward, and Chuck moved with him, not behind his dad, not around him, but ahead of him, placing himself directly in the path of violence. His father reached out, but Chuck was already there, already shifting, already preparing. The time for holding back had passed. The world had chosen violence, but Chuck would choose how it unfolded. He stood tall, his back to his father, a protector's stance. As the bikers advanced, Chuck's father's voice rose one last time, cracking slightly but filled with unwavering conviction. "Don't you dare underestimate him." That wasn't a warning for the bikers. It was a declaration to the room, a truth no one could deny any longer. Chuck Norris had tried to be just a son having dinner, but some men only understood respect when they were forced to swallow it. And tonight, they were about to learn exactly what that meant. The burly biker came first. His boots struck the floor in heavy, deliberate stomps as he closed the distance in 3 furious strides. Chuck's father instinctively took a half step forward, as though prepared to share the danger. But Chuck extended one arm back, not pushing, not forcing, just enough to say, "Stay behind me. I've got this." The first punch swung toward Chuck's jaw, a wide, reckless arc powered more by alcohol and ego than technique. Chuck shifted his weight, feet gliding smoothly across the floor. The fist cut through empty air, where his face had been a fraction of a second before. In the same motion, Chuck's hands snapped forward, striking the biker's forearm near the wrist with precise force. It was not a dramatic blow. It didn't send the man spinning, but pain jolted up the biker's arm like a lightning strike. He yelped and stumbled back, clutching his wrist, suddenly sobered by the shock of real consequence. A stunned hush swept across the room. Another biker leaner, faster, sprang up from his seat with a feral roar. He lunged with both hands, aiming to grab and tackle Chuck to the ground. Chuck stepped aside at the last second, twisting his body and grabbing the attacker by the back of his vest. He redirected the man's force, using his own momentum against him, sending him sailing shoulder first into the nearest table. Plates and drinks crashed to the floor in a cascade of shattered glass and spilled beer. Chuck didn't wait. He turned, scanning for the next threat. The leader had taken several steps back. His calculated interest had been replaced by something colder, sharper realization. He had thought they were toying with a harmless actor. Now he understood they had prodded a sleeping dragon. "Get him!" Travis barked, voice cracking with equal parts anger and fear. The bikers surged. 3 men moved at once. The first swung a bottle like a club. Chuck ducked under it, the glass flashing inches above his head. A second biker attempted to grapple him from the side. Chuck planted a foot and drove an elbow into the man's ribs. One clean strike that knocked the wind out of him. Without pausing, Chuck whipped his arm around, catching the third biker across the jaw with a back fist that snapped the man's head sideways. He crumpled to the floor. The bottle-wielding biker pivoted for another swing. Chuck caught the man's wrist mid-motion, squeezed just long enough to make the biker drop the bottle, then kicked it away under a booth. The biker snarled, desperate to regain the upper hand, but Chuck's foot lashed out in a low sweeping kick that took the man off balance. He hit the floor hard, the impact chasing a grunt from his lungs. It happened quickly, seconds stretched into moments of perfect clarity. Chuck didn't think. He flowed. His movements were poetry sharpened into survival, decades of practice distilled into instinct and precision. His father watched, amazement and pride blending into something fierce and bright in his eyes. The waitress, frozen near the bar with her hands covering her mouth, stared as though witnessing a myth come alive. The leader finally stepped forward. His expression had changed. No smirk remained. He wasn't amused anymore. He lifted his chin. "Enough!" he commanded. The lone word cracked through the chaos like a rifle shot. The remaining bikers slowed, breathing hard. Those who were still on their feet exchanged uncertain glances. The leader approached with a deliberate calm that made the room feel colder. Chuck squared his shoulders, but did not strike. He watched carefully as the leader stopped only a meter away. "You're better than I thought," the big man said. There was no mockery left in his voice, only respect, grudging and reluctant. "But this ain't over. Around here we don't—" He paused, searching for the right threat. "And we don't take kindly to anyone making us look weak." Chuck's father stepped up beside his son now. Though he leaned slightly into Chuck for balance, he stood tall. "Your men took care of that themselves," he said. A twitch of rage crossed the leader's face, just a flicker before disappearing beneath something controlled and dangerous. He didn't move yet, calculating whether another fight was worth the cost. He could see his men groaning on the ground, dazed, holding bruised limbs and bleeding lips. Fear, thin but real, had leaked into their confidence. The leader glanced toward Travis. "Pick yourself up," he ordered, voice low. Travis, who had regained some balance, wiped blood from the corner of his mouth and glared at Chuck's father. Not at Chuck, not at the man who had just dismantled his friends, but at the elder he still considered an easier target. "You're dead," Travis hissed. "Both of you. You don't know who we are." Chuck stepped closer, eyes turning into steel. "You don't know who he is, and you don't know who I am either, if you think threatening him will help you." The leader raised a hand again, halting Travis from charging. The authority in that gesture was absolute dangerous animals, leashed not by law, but by loyalty to a power stronger than their rage. The leader spoke with quiet intensity. "You think this ends here? You think we're just a bunch of losers riding around causing bar fights? He leaned forward. We've got a lot of friends and a lot of reach. Chuck's father didn't break his gaze. So do we, he answered. They just don't ride motorcycles. The leader straightened, breathing out through his nose. A dark smile crept across his lips, one that promised retaliation far beyond the walls of this bar. But for now, the balance of power had shifted too far out of his favor. He understood consequences. He understood survival. He motioned toward the door with 2 fingers. The order was unmistakable. Let's go! The bikers staggered and limped to obey, retrieving jackets and helmets with curses muttered under their breath. Chairs scraped, boots thudded. A few turned back to throw poisonous glares at Chuck and his father, but no one dared step forward again. The leader lingered last, pausing at the doorway. He pointed one thick finger toward Chuck, not like a threat anymore, but like a vow. We'll see you again, Norris. Then they were gone. The door slammed behind them, rattling the walls. Silence followed, heavy, breathless. Then came the sound of a glass set down on the counter. A patron exhaled sharply. Someone whispered, "Holy hell!" Chuck stood still, every muscle alert, but his father gently placed a hand against his side. "It's over," the old man said, "for tonight." Chuck breathed in slowly. The adrenaline that had carried him through the confrontation faded, leaving behind a calm stillness. The waitress rushed over, voice trembling with a mix of shock and gratitude. "Are you both all right? They could have—" Chuck shook his head. "We're fine. You okay?" She nodded quickly, though her hands told a different story. Around them, patrons began to shift and murmur, some offering looks of awe, others of relief. A man near the bar raised his drink in silent respect. Another gave Chuck's father a nod that said thank you without a word. Chuck sat again, steadying his father as he lowered himself into the booth. The adrenaline had hidden the pain, but now his father winced sharply. "You hurt?" Chuck asked. "Only my pride," his father replied with a tight smile. "I should have handled them myself." Chuck laughed softly despite the lingering tension. "You started the fight. I just finished it," his father grinned. "Good to know I still have a little influence on you." The waitress brought ice wrapped in a towel for his father's shoulder. The owner approached next, an older man with a thick mustache and worry lines marking his forehead. "I'm sorry," the owner muttered. "I should have done something sooner. They've been getting worse lately. They think they run the town." Chuck looked around the bar, seeing familiar memories overlaid on what remained of this place. "Maybe it's time the town reminded them they don't." The owner swallowed and nodded. "Drinks are on the house. Whatever you want." Chuck's father raised a hand. "Coffee's fine. Fresh pot if you can manage it." The owner hurried off with a flustered, Yes, sir." Chuck leaned back, letting the tension slowly unravel. His father looked at him for a long moment, eyes soft and thoughtful. "You really didn't want to fight," his father said quietly. "No," Chuck agreed, "but some things are worth fighting for." His father nodded, a slow gesture filled with emotion deeper than pride. "There's one thing I know for certain," he said. "Tonight, my son wasn't a movie star. He was just the best man in the room." Chuck lowered his gaze for a moment, humbled. Outside, the roar of motorcycle engines shattered the momentary calm. The gang wasn't far. They lingered long enough to remind the bar they were still watching, but then the engines faded, swallowed by the night. The waitress returned with fresh coffee and, despite everything dinner plates she insisted on replacing, still warm and clean. She set them down gently, as though afraid the smallest disturbance could reignite what had just been extinguished. Chuck's father took a sip. It was better now, maybe because the taste of victory made even average coffee sweeter. "They'll be back," Chuck said quietly. His father nodded. "I know." Chuck looked toward the exit where Danger had just walked away on 2 wheels. "We'll be ready." His father placed a hand on his son's arm again, firm, steady, unafraid. "We always are." The engines had faded into the darkness, like the final threat of a storm pulling away over the distant hills. Yet even after their rumble had disappeared entirely, the tension they left behind still vibrated in the walls, in the tables, in the very air Chuck breathed. It felt as though the bar itself hadn't decided whether it could relax. Chuck and his father lingered for a few minutes longer, finishing what was left of their meal in a quieter world. The laughter that had filled the bar earlier didn't return. Conversations, when they resumed, were hushed and reverent, as though speaking too loudly might draw trouble back. The waitress checked on them frequently, more than necessary, but it was clear she needed reassurance that they were truly all right. Chuck's father rolled his shoulder gently beneath the cold press of the ice pack and winced at the stiffness that was settling in. "Getting old is a hell of a thing," he muttered. "You still stood taller than any man in here," Chuck said, purposely loud enough that anyone pretending not to listen would hear. A few nearby patrons smiled behind their glasses. The owner hovered near the counter, his gaze fixed on the door, almost as if expecting it to burst open again at any second. Chuck finished the last sip of his iced tea, set the glass down, and exhaled slowly. The worst had passed, but the aftershock still worked its way through his muscles. "You ready to head out?" Chuck asked. His father nodded and pushed himself up from the booth, slower this time, but steady. Chuck placed a supportive hand under his arm, not because his father needed it, but because Chuck needed to offer it. The owner rushed over, wringing his hands together nervously. I'm real sorry this happened. They've been coming in more often, acting like they own the place. I should have banned them a long time ago." Chuck shook his head lightly. "You didn't make their decisions for them." The owner swallowed. "Still, thank you. If you two hadn't been here tonight, I don't know what would have happened." Chuck's father gave a look that was both tired and reassuring. "Bars like this are part of the heart of a town. Don't let men like that take pieces of it away." The owner nodded, absorbing every word like a man given instructions on rebuilding something precious. The waitress waved timidly from a safe distance. "You two take care, okay?" Chuck smiled. "You too, and maybe keep the tables bolted down," he added gently, and she let out the tiniest laugh, fragile but real. They stepped outside into the crisp night. The door swung shut behind them with a final thump, sealing the uneasy silence inside. Out here, the world felt clearer, the cool air washing away some of the tension that clung to their shoulders. The moon sat high overhead, casting soft silver across the parking lot, and their parked truck waited in a pool of lamplight. Chuck scanned the area, automatically habit, instinct checking the corners, listening for anything that didn't belong. But the bikers were gone. Only the faint, lingering smell of exhaust hinted at their earlier presence. His father stopped beside the truck but didn't immediately climb in. Instead, he turned to face Chuck fully. "You know," his father said, adjusting the ice pack against his shoulder, "I've always been proud of you, for more than the movies, for the man you've become." His voice wavered just slightly, emotion threading through his words. "But tonight, seeing you stand up like that, not out of anger but out of love," he shook his head. "I don't have the right words for it." Chuck looked at him, really looked, and felt the weight of years settle gently into place between them. They had grown older, walked different paths, built separate lives. But some bonds didn't stretch thin over time. They only grew stronger. "I learned it from you," Chuck said softly. His father gave a small nod, eyes glinting in the lamplight. "Well," he muttered, clearing his throat and straightening his jacket, "I guess I taught you something after all." Chuck opened the passenger door for him, always the gentleman, earning a mock-annoyed scowl from the old man, who let himself be helped anyway. Chuck rounded the truck to the driver's side and climbed in, the engine growling awake beneath them, as though shaking off its own nerves. They pulled out of the parking lot and onto the quiet road. For several minutes, neither spoke. The headlights carved a narrow path through the night, illuminating only what mattered to move forward. The town passed by in familiar hush-dark shops, shuttered windows, lonely street lamps flickering like fireflies frozen in place. Finally, his father let out a slow breath. "I didn't like how they talked to you," he said into the silence. Chuck let his hands rest easy on the wheel. "I didn't like how they talked to you." His father gave a soft chuckle. "Seems we're both stubborn." Chuck nodded once. "Runs in the family." They drove on. The glow of city limits began to fade, replaced by the starry spread of countryside that stretched toward home. The tension eased into the kind of quiet that felt earned, like peace reclaimed. After some time, his father glanced sideways at him. "You think they'll come back?" Chuck thought about the leader's parting words, the promise hanging in the doorway. The threat that hadn't been yelled, but spoken calmly, the kind that was never made lightly. Maybe, Chuck said, but we'll handle it if they do. His father hummed thoughtfully. Good, he said. I'd hate for them to think they scared us. Chuck smiled a slow, fearless smile. They didn't. The truck continued down the road, the night opening ahead of them like a long, dark ribbon, lit only by the path they made for themselves. Home lay somewhere on the horizon, waiting, welcoming, untouched by the violence they had just left behind. Out here, the world felt simpler. Out here, a son and his father were just two men driving home after dinner. Yet as simple as it seemed, something had shifted tonight, something important. Chuck's father reached out and rested his hand on his son's arm again. It wasn't trembling anymore. It wasn't bracing or guiding. It was gratitude, trust, love. Let's go home, he said gently. Chuck nodded, the corners of his mouth lifting again. Always. The road stretched forward and they drove toward dawn, side by side, ready for whatever came next.